This podcast features criminologists discussing sensitive themes and topics. Listener discretion is advised.
A woman is viciously attacked by a neighbor's dog and dies from her injuries. This tragic event would have many people debating the appropriate punishment for the pet's owner. This is the Diane Whipple story. Hi, Meghan.
I'm already terrified just by the introduction. I just want you to know.
I'm sorry. I knew this would be hard for you, this type of case.
Well, we have to do hard cases. I mean, that's just the reality. And I'm sure that you picked it for reasons that will be revealed that'll, be important to discuss. So I'm just going to go with that for now.
Yes, and I know that our listeners and most people don't like to hear cases that involve animals, but I think this case is important. Not only does it bring up a really interesting conversation, this case also changed the law in civil cases in a certain area.
Okay.
So I think it is in a really interesting way. And this case, Meghan, I came across myself. Although this case is a little bit older, I saw it in my news feed. There was a story because it's been recently in the headlines again due to an update. So, of course, we will get to that part. But first, let's meet Diane and learn about what happened here. Diane was born on January 31st, 1967 in Princeton, New Jersey, and grew up in Manhasset, New York, which, as you know, Meghan, is on Long Island, right?
Yeah, I used to play them. When I was in high school, we used to play them in field hockey all the time. They were great. I don't think we ever won, but they were really good.
I think it's funny that even though this case, as we'll see, it does take place in California, but somehow there's always ties to New Jersey and Long Island to reiterate our accents to everyone.
Not my accent. All right.
I don't know about that. But anyway, Diane mostly lived with her grandparents growing up. I'm not exactly sure where her parents were, but by all accounts, she did have a happy childhood. And from a young age, she was a very competitive athlete. Diane played lacrosse all through high school, and she was so good that she was named a 2-time All-American player. Now, I must admit, I had absolutely no idea what that meant. Do you?
Nope.
Okay, well, clearly neither one of us were an All-American player.
Nope.
So very briefly, what it is, for those of you who, like us, do not know, the All-American designation is an annual honor that's bestowed upon an amateur athlete from the United States who's considered to be one of the best in their sports. So basically, people who receive this distinction are typically added to an All-American team for their particular sport. And many of these individuals will go on to play on Olympic teams or in professional sports.
Oh, okay. That's probably why I didn't know, Amy. I don't think anyone was recruiting me for, Olympic play.
Nope. Diane attended Penn State University, where she continued excelling at lacrosse, and she also began to compete in track and field, which she was also extremely skilled at. Now, after college, Diane moved to San Francisco to take a job as a lacrosse coach for St. Mary's College of California. And she was really beloved by her players. They described her as innovative and warm and just an all-around excellent coach. When Diane wasn't coaching, she was also still very much into competitive sports. She was a 2-time member of the U.S. Women's Lacrosse World Cup team, and she missed qualifying for the 1996 U.S. Olympic track and field team by mere seconds, and this was in the 800-meter race.
Wow.
Yes. Diane did have some struggles, too. She was also a cancer survivor. She had thyroid cancer, but at the time of the events we are discussing, she was in remission and doing very well. In fact, just a week before, she ran a marathon. Diane also was in a very committed relationship. Diane and her long-term partner, Sharon Smith, shared an apartment in the Pacific Heights area of San Francisco, and the two had enjoyed 6 years of a happy relationship. However, one traumatic moment would change their lives forever. On the afternoon of January 26, 2001, just days shy of her 34th birthday, Diane had picked up some groceries for dinner because she planned on making a nice meal for her and Sharon that evening. Diane returned to their apartment around 4 p.m., and while unlocking the door, she noticed that her neighbor, Marjorie Knoller, was coming down the hallway with one of her large dogs. Now, this dog was named Bane, and he was about 140 pounds and about 3 feet tall. And upon opening her door, Hera, Marjorie's other dog, a 113-pound female, came out of the apartment.
Do you know what breeds these dogs were? They're huge. I just was curious.
Yeah, so I wasn't aware. I've never heard of this breed, but once I looked them up, they looked very familiar to me. Now, these dogs were a breed called Presa Canarios, and they're a large Mastiff breed, originally bred in Spain and used to protect cattle from wild dogs. Unfortunately, they were also frequently used for dog fighting until it was banned in the 1950s. But as we know, just because something's banned doesn't mean the behavior stops.
Did you say that they live in an apartment building?
They're in an apartment building, and yes, those are very large dogs to be confined to an apartment.
Right. And I was just thinking, I don't know what the rules were then, but geez, like landlords now, I don't know that you'd be able to bring in 200-plus-pound dogs. Okay.
Yeah, and these dogs, when they're properly trained and socialized, like most dogs, they can be docile, devoted, obedient to their family, and just wonderful dogs to have around. However, they are natural guard dogs, so they are hyper-aware and highly suspicious of strangers, and sometimes they act aggressively towards people or animals that they don't know. And if they're bred the wrong way, they can be extremely violent. So this breed often requires extra care and attention to both socialization and training early in life so that they can safely interact with other dogs and people. And aesthetically, they're gorgeous. They might be intimidating considering their size. They're very muscular, very stocky, but they are really good-looking dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Diane was scared of these dogs as only a month earlier, one of them has snapped at her wrist. And I have to mention here that Diane was a very petite woman, only around 110 pounds, and she was about 5'3".
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, individually, these dogs outweighed her. And Sharon would later explain that she was also fearful of the dogs, and both of the women had gotten into the habit of slowly opening their apartment door to see if the dogs were in the hallway every time they left their home.
That's a hard way
imagine?
to live. No, that's scary.
Yeah. And these dogs seemed very aggressive to many of the other neighbors in the building, we would also come to learn. So it wasn't just Diane and Sharon who were a little fearful of these dogs.
Sure. I'm sure if people had kids, they were scared too.
Yeah. And unfortunately for Diane, her fears were warranted as almost immediately upon catching sight of Diane at her door, both dogs escaped Marjorie's grasp and viciously attacked Diane. Meghan, while I won't get too graphic, the following is really hard to hear, so I suggest skipping about a minute ahead if you are sensitive to hearing more details about this attack. Though Marjorie says she tried to subdue her dogs, it was difficult. Marjorie herself was a small woman, and these dogs together weighed about 250 pounds.
Yeah, I think that's a consideration when you're getting a dog, what the weight is and what you can reasonably manage. I have to say, we have a 60-pound dog, and I sometimes find it hard to control her as well. I can, don't get me wrong, but it's not easy. Mm-hmm. So I know just that weight ratio. And, I weigh more than double her, a good amount double her. So the weight ratio sounds not good to me.
Yeah, and it wasn't because Marjorie tried to control these dogs, but it was too late. The dogs viciously ripped off Diane's clothing, biting and clawing at her exposed skin, and there was no way to get them off. They were in fight mode.
Was Sharon there?
Sharon was not. Sharon was at work, but some of the other neighbors heard the commotion and, they looked out their peephole and they called 911. Now, all of the neighbors say they were too fearful to go out to actually help Diane.
Right.
But first responders arrived within 7 minutes, but they arrived to a quite horrific scene. They found Diane clinging to life and a shaken-up Marjorie who was too scared to go back into her apartment where their dogs now were. So she was able, at some point in those 7 minutes, Marjorie was able to get the dogs back into the apartment. Marjorie told first responders, immediately, she says to them, quote, "I told her to stay still. If she had, this would never have happened." So I want to point out this is the first of several statements that deflect blame and shift the blame to the victim here.
I was just going to say that's terrible that she said that. Was the first thing she said.
Oh, wait till you hear some of the later comments. So within minutes, Diane horrifically suffered almost 80 separate deep bites covering her body from head to toe. And this would include a severe wound to her trachea. As one first responder reported, she'd literally been bitten on every part of her body except for her scalp and the soles of her feet. Sadly, though she was rushed to the hospital, doctors were not able to save her. Ugh. You see, the dog attack resulted in Diane losing a third of her blood, as well as suffering blunt force trauma and multiple traumatic injuries. Her ultimate cause of death was heart failure.
Oh, this poor woman.
At first, Diane's death was viewed as a tragic accident. However, this would very soon change. So the big question here is what had just happened? Who was this neighbor who had these two huge dogs, and where had they gotten them? How did we get here? Okay, so we need to start with the neighbors themselves. We have Marjorie Noller, the woman who was walking the dog. She was 45 years old, and her husband, Robert Noel, who was 59. Now, Robert was not home at the time. Now, both of these two were lawyers who mostly worked from home. And they did mostly noble work, such as defense for people with mental illnesses, and they also defended prison guards and inmates in various kinds of cases. They both did a lot of pro bono work, but they also had some questionable associations. You see, the couple had a close relationship to an inmate by the name of Paul Cornfed Schneider. Now, Paul was imprisoned at Pelican Bay, serving a life without parole sentence for 2 attempted murders. Oh, and Paul was also a member and a leader of the Aryan Brotherhood.
Did they represent him?
Oh, just you wait.
Okay.
And they did more than represent him. But yes, at some point they were representing him, but they met him because they were representing a prison guard at Pelican Bay. So somehow they came across each other. I want to give you a little more information on Paul.
Okay.
Now, Paul was originally locked up in 1985 for an armored car robbery. And he had been incarcerated in the secure housing unit, the SHU, of Pelican Bay State Prison since the early 90s. So for most of his time, he was essentially in solitary confinement, where he was locked in his cell almost 23 hours a day, never allowed outdoors, and only permitted contact with the outside world through letters and strictly monitored visits.
Interesting that you brought that up, Amy.
Yeah.
I just literally taught a class last week about the SHU, special housing or solitary, in Pelican Bay, and the significant lawsuits that came from them that changed their practices, which were among the very worst in the nation.
Do you teach that in policy?
Yeah, I do.
Just to give you an idea of how dangerous this man was, one former guard referred to Paul as the most dangerous inmate in California at one time. And we know that there are many, many horrific offenders in California, as there are in other states, but just to give you an idea. And Meghan, somehow, while at Pelican Bay, he managed to set up a dog breeding operation called Dog O' War Kennels, which, would you like to guess what it bred?
Presa Canarios.
Presa Canarios.
Was he breeding them for fighting or was he breeding them?
Well, it depends who you believe. Now, these dogs were very pricey, selling for over $2,000 per puppy. And prison investigators suspected that the dogs were being raised to protect Aryan Brotherhood criminal enterprises such as meth labs. I'm unsure what evidence they had, but given Paul's background, this sounds like a pretty strong possibility.
And you're going to tell me that this is where Marjorie and her husband got the dogs?
It gets even more bizarre, Meghan, because Marjorie and Robert, they adopted 38-year-old Paul.
Oh my gosh. This is like, I just covered Eileen Wuornos and she was adopted as an adult too. You know, I've never heard of that before, Eileen, and this is only the second time I've ever heard of this.
I didn't even know that I had never heard of this, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about adult adoptions and then we'll get back to this particular adult adoption. So typically, adult adoptions occur when care is needed for an adult who has diminished capacity or some sort of disability that requires care or guardianship. Now, there's a lot of state specifics, but most states will say there has to be at least a 10-year age gap between the person adopting and the adoptee. And in California specifically, once an adult adoption is complete, the parties assume toward each other a legal parent-child relationship, and this includes all rights and responsibilities of such a relationship, which includes inheritance rights. Now, not only did they adopt Paul, they also adopted another adult male by the name of Dale Breches. Now, the interesting thing about this adoption, or these adoptions, is that they were finalized just days after this dog attack happened.
Amy, do you know why they adopted him or why they're adopting this other person?
Yeah, well, that depends on who you ask and what you believe. Now, the couple say it's because they wanted to be able to make medical decisions on Paul's behalf, as he had no other family. And they also say that they loved him. But others think it was probably something a little more nefarious, and it likely was, because things are even stranger, because it turns out the couple wanted to be in a 3-way marriage with Paul. But since that was illegal, they decided to adopt him. There were even many sexually explicit letters and photos sent amongst the three. There were some reports that there were photos of Marjorie and Bane the dog, but I'm going to just leave it at that.
Like, my face dropped and, just when I thought I'd heard it all.
Yeah, but regardless of why the couple adopted Paul, This is extremely important because Paul was the owner of the dogs, Bane and Hera.
Because he bred them? Is that why? Or
Well, yeah, again, police officials say the dogs were likely part of an illegal dog fighting ring that was run from prison by the Aryan Brotherhood. Also, again, there were these reports that they were bred to guard meth labs.
Okay,
So
right.
there was some talk that these dogs were bred to guard meth labs having to do with the Aryan Brotherhood, but then there was also some talk of his involvement with the Mexican mafia.
Okay.
Of course, Marjorie and Robert deny all of these allegations.
Well, I definitely wouldn't, confess to them either, but
Yes. Regardless of their original location or who owns these dogs, after Paul's incarceration, Bane and Hera were placed in the care of someone else. And they were pretty young, these dogs. Allegedly, the woman who was caring for the dogs gave them up because she was scared of them because they had killed her livestock and the caretaker's domestic pets. So this is where Marjorie and Robert come in. They adopted the dogs for Paul. So on Paul's behalf, they adopted the dogs from this woman in the spring of 2020. And this would be less than a year before these dogs would brutally attack Diane in front of her own door.
I have to say this is really unbelievable. What happened to the dogs?
So Bane was put down immediately after the attack. It took 3 tranquilizers from animal control to subdue him. And then Hera was euthanized about a year later. And, this might be controversial, but this does make me sad. I am a dog lover, but I also don't know much about dog training. But I wonder, is it possible to rehabilitate a violent dog?
So, yes, Amy, the answer is absolutely that the dogs could be rehabilitated, they could be rehomed, but then you have to weigh that against who's going to actually take these dogs after they have perpetrated such an act. Who would want to take that responsibility, the fear? So while it could be done, would anyone realistically want to do it? I don't know.
Well, and anyone who would be likely using the dogs for nefarious reasons, and that's not good either. So, yeah, the whole thing, this is tricky, but yes, the dogs were responsible for the brutal death of this woman. So let's get into the legal side of things here, Meghan, because there's a lot to go through. So first, on March 27th, 2001, a San Francisco grand jury returned an indictment charging Marjorie with second-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and ownership of a mischievous animal causing death. The indictment also charged Robert with involuntary manslaughter and ownership of a mischievous animal causing death. Not surprisingly, both defendants pled not guilty to all charges, and they also didn't show much compassion or remorse. They even blamed the victim, telling the media that the reason Diane had been attacked was that she had moved in the wrong direction, or perhaps as an athlete, she was given off certain pheromones due to steroid usage. Which, first of all, there's no evidence of her ever using steroids. And even if she did, I think it's disgusting to even insinuate that anything she did led to this attack.
I think it is as well, but I think that they're going to find no sympathy by turning the dial that way and blaming the victim or trying to. I think that's going to work against them.
Certainly not. And to make it even worse, they claim that Bane didn't bite Diane until Diane struck Marjorie in the face during the melee, which again has never been substantiated and is unlikely true. Why would Diane raise a hand to Marjorie when she was already fearful of these dogs? Let alone, it doesn't seem like Diane was the kind of person to raise her hand to anyone to begin with.
I have to tell you, this case is making my blood boil over here.
Yeah, well, you weren't the only one because there was a lot of publicity surrounding this case and the public was angry. And I'm sure this had to do with, again, these gross public statements. And actually another one, in one interview, Marjorie said that Bane had, quote, sniffed Whipple's crotch like she was a bitch in heat.
What?
These comments they show their clear lack of remorse, responsibility, humanity. So there was a motion for a change of venue because I think the defense realized that people were not on the side of these two defendants. So the judge did grant this motion and ordered the trial to be held in Los Angeles County. Keep in mind, this case was still pretty well known in Los Angeles County, but I think the public sentiment was maybe less against the defendants. The pair also motioned for a severance for separate trials. So usually a severance would be granted by a judge if they believe for any reason that a defendant will suffer prejudice as a result of being tried jointly with a co-defendant.
So you think they wanted to sever the trial so they could point the finger at each other? Better shot that way?
That's interesting because I didn't get that feeling. I don't know if they were just trying to have the best chances and research tells us that people that are enjoying trials are, you're more likely going to find them both. If one's guilty, the other one's going to be guilty by association. Yeah. So I would imagine that also their charges were a little bit different. Marjorie was being charged with second-degree murder, where Robert was not. So I would imagine Robert's attorney probably wanted to get him separated.
Yep.
But again, that was denied. So the two were tried together. And this trial began on February 15th, 2002 in Los Angeles County. Now, at the trial, the defense's main argument was that Marjorie had attempted to defend Diane during the attack. Her attorney went as far to say that she was heroic. Okay, so she had, a minor cut on her hand, and they showed a picture of Marjorie. She was covered in blood with slight bruises, but it would turn out that it was all Diane's blood and that she was barely injured upon closer examination. Now, Marjorie herself testified and insisted she tried to protect Diane, even at one point putting her body on top of Diane's to protect her. But again, she said Diane kept moving. So again, her fault that she was victimized.
I mean, the blaming is horrific. Is there any evidence or any reason to believe that she did try to protect Diane? Or it's just kind of she said, what do you believe? Is that kind of where we're at?
Yeah, I don't think there is any evidence. There was no other witnesses there. I told you some people were looking out of their peepholes, but there was just so much going on, such a traumatic scene that it was really hard to know what was going on. And it all happened pretty fast.
And of course, even if Diane's blood is on her, that's likely from, or could likely be from her dogs. Like her touching her dogs after.
Yeah. Well, also horrifically at the scene, Diane's blood had traveled over 20 feet during the attack. So this means Marjorie could have even been standing further away, not even fully involved in what was going on. And Marjorie also denied that Bain and Hera never gave her any reason to believe that they posed a danger to any person. She denied ever seeing Bain or Hera bite, lunge, or act aggressively toward any person. And she also asserted she never lost control of Bain prior to Whipple's death, and she had never seen her husband lose control of Bain. Now, I'm sure you could imagine what the prosecution's going to do.
I would imagine they have rebuttal witnesses. They're going to have people who are going to say completely the opposite. They've witnessed it. They've either been attacked. They were fearful. Like, I'm sure the state has rebuttal witnesses to that.
I mean, they brought forward witness after witness to testify that it was very well known to the owners that Bain and Hera were dangerous, but the couple also refused to control the dogs. So just to go through some of this evidence, one vet who treated the dogs in 2000 testified that he took the unprecedented step of writing the couple a letter after his office found that Bain was unsafe to handle. The letter actually stated that the dogs would, quote, be a liability in any household.
Okay.
Now, he actually told the court that he felt so convinced that the potential was so great that he had wanted to let Marjorie Knoller know in case she simply wasn't aware of the seriousness of the situation.
So he penned it. He put it in a letter. He put it down on paper. Oh,
yes.
My goodness.
And he told them it's in writing, and it was also told to them. Now, a professional dog walker who worked in the building also testified that she had suggested to Robert that he should muzzle his dogs, but Robert told her to shut up and called her offensive names.
Jeez.
Many neighbors also testified about how fearful they were around the dogs and how the owners could barely handle them, particularly Marjorie, who had trouble even walking them.
Right.
It was also revealed to the jury that Robert was missing a finger because Bain had severed it in a previous attack.
No.
Yes. But yet Marjorie says she wasn't aware that these dogs posed any danger when her husband lost a finger at the hand of one of these dogs. So there's just lots of evidence.
This is unbelievable.
Yeah. Prosecution's testimony also showcased Marjorie and Robert's lack of compassion, as one paramedic recalled that Marjorie never asked about Diane Whipple's condition and didn't even attempt to help her. Now, lastly, you have one of Robert's acquaintances who testified that Hera had bitten him in front of Robert, and Robert was pretty flippant about it, didn't apologize or even try to stop his dog's behavior. And this attack happened about a year prior to Diane's attack.
I mean, did they think that none of this was going to come out? This seems like such a terrible strategy for a defense for two attorneys.
Yes, they should have just tried to take a plea because the evidence is overwhelming.
Exactly.
There was also plenty of evidence that suggested that the couple were involved in breeding the dogs for violence. Remember Paul's kennel visit that we talked about, the dog-o-war business? Well, in the couple's apartment, police found 39 copies of a 3-page typed document entitled Dog-o-War Presas, and the document had a logo at the top, a description of the breeding operation, and contact information. And the picture between the line "Dog o' War" and the line "Priestess" was a dog with its mouth open and teeth bared.
Oh my God.
They were also
Okay.
mailed a book from prison, well, actually from their prison son, their other prison son. Dale had sent them a book called Man Stopper, Training a Canine Guardian. So these pieces of evidence were used to argue that these two were actively involved in the dog breeding business that was formed by the two men in prison. And though there was no explicit proof that these animals were likely to be sold to people who would use them for violence, I think it's clear what's going on here.
But why would the couple want them? I mean, were they involved in?
If I had, from what it seems like, is they were in this relationship with Paul and they were doing Paul a favor. Paul
Right,
needed
okay.
somebody to hold the dogs probably till he sold them.
Gotcha.
I don't think you'll be surprised to find that the jury found both guilty of involuntary manslaughter and guilty of owning a mischievous animal that caused the death of a human being. However, they also found Marjorie Knoller guilty of second-degree murder, which did come as a surprise to many. In California, second-degree murder is the unlawful killing of a human being that is done with malice aforethought, but without deliberation and premeditation. So in this situation I'm describing, the person should have known that their actions could result in death. So this would be like shooting into a crowd. You don't have specific malice against an individual victim, but there's implied malice. It's like a mental state and a form of malice aforethought, meaning that you're not specifically targeting an individual, but you know that what you could do can cause death.
Okay.
So in other words, even if the killing is unintentional, which I think in this case it was, there's no reason to believe that Marjorie wanted to kill Diane. However, the malice aforethought for the murder may be applied where the accused consciously disregards the risk to human life.
And they're saying she did. They saw the evidence that the dogs posed a danger over and over and over again, and a reasonable person would have done something differently or known better. I understand why that might be controversial, but I see how they made that burden.
Yeah, I mean, their convictions were mostly based on the argument that the couple knew the dogs were dangerously aggressive towards other people and that they had not taken the sufficient precautions to protect people. Again, it was never proven or disproven whether or not the dogs were being trained to attack and fight. Okay, but it was clear that they posed a danger. Now, this is where things get legally interesting, even more so. Although the jury found Marjorie guilty of second-degree murder, the trial judge, James Warren, granted her a new trial on the second-degree murder conviction. Now, this is allowed. If a jury finds somebody guilty, a judge can come in and say, we need to look at this more. If a jury finds somebody not guilty, the judge cannot come in and say, no, they're guilty.
So did the judge set aside the verdict, or
He granted a new trial. So yes, he set aside the verdict.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. He believed that the appropriate standard for second-degree murder required that Marjorie knew that taking the dog into the hall involved a high probability of death.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It's a very subjective standard here.
Yes.
So although the judge granted the new trial for the second-degree murder charge, he did sentence Marjorie Knoller to 4 years in prison for the lesser included involuntary manslaughter charge. And this was on July 15th, 2002.
Okay. And so she'd have a new trial anyway for the second-degree murder. Okay.
Correct. But she's serving time for the other charge. Now, the state appealed the judge's action and sought to reinstate the second-degree murder conviction. So the state disagreed with the judge.
Of course.
And just as a quick aside, meanwhile, Robert was also sentenced. However, he only spent a little over a year incarcerated. So he was released on September 14th, 2003, while all of this stuff is happening with the legal side of things with Marjorie.
Okay.
Now, soon after Robert's release, in 2004, Marjorie was released on the manslaughter conviction, and she was now out on bail while her second-degree murder conviction was under appeal.
So how long did she serve, Amy?
Less than 2 years.
Okay.
In May 2005, the state appellate court reversed the judge's grant of a new second-degree murder trial for Marjorie. Now,
So they reinstated her conviction? Is that what they did?
So, yeah, they ruled. It goes back and forth a few times, okay? So the appellate court, now they're ruling that implied malice, again, implied malice is when you're not targeting an individual, but what you're doing is, you should know it's dangerous enough.
Okay.
So the appellate court said that implied malice did not require knowledge of a high probability of death, like the original trial judge believed it did. But rather, the appellate court said there just needs to be a conscious disregard of serious bodily injury. So the appellate court returned the case to the lower court to reconsider Marjorie's motion for a new trial.
Okay.
And they pretty much told the court to use the serious bodily injury standard for implied malice murder.
Wow, this is some hell of a case.
It really is, because it's not over yet, Meghan.
I get.
She then appealed the appellate court decision to the Supreme Court of California, but they rejected it because they ruled that implied malice murder required proof that a defendant acted with conscious disregard of the danger to human life. So the California Supreme Court held the trial court standard for implied malice murder. So what this means is that this case was sent back to the trial court stage, and the trial court was told to reconsider whether to allow the second-degree murder conviction to stand in light of this new reasoning, which has to do with the conscious disregard for serious bodily injury.
But it's always interesting because this goes back to the original trial judge who set aside the verdict, who now has to reconsider this given the legal standard set by a higher court. Okay.
Yes. So finally, after all of this legal back and forth, Meghan, the San Francisco Supreme Court reinstated Marjorie's conviction for second-degree murder, and on September 22nd, 2008, the court sentenced Marjorie to 15 years to life for second-degree murder.
Wow, that really ran the gamut of the courts in ways that's very rare.
Yes. And I couldn't believe it, but Marjorie appealed once again. But this time the court was quick to, shut it down. And they said, no, this, we're done here.
Yeah, this is the end of the line. In the end, she winds up being convicted second-degree murder, and she will serve a sentence of 15 years.
Of 15 to life.
I see.
That's
okay.
Quite a hefty sentence. I mean, she appealed several times, but her charges were upheld at every level. Marjorie's first application for parole came after 11 years in jail, and this was in February of 2019. However, the California commissioner denied her application.
I wonder if she showed remorse, or I wonder if what had changed, if anything had changed, in fact.
I will tell you that actually in just a moment. But first, I want to tell you that she went up again in 2023, which seems like a long time. That's 4 years in between her first time. But I have a feeling it has to do with COVID delays. I'm not positive, but
probably
someone would normally go up for parole quicker than that 4-year gap. Her parole was denied yet again, and this time we have a little more information as to the information that went into this decision.
Okay.
The 2-member panel cited Marjorie's institutional record, which included 2 disciplinary actions against her. One of them was for biting a prison guard in 2016.
You're kidding
Yeah,
me.
and I don't know what the second one was for, but I would imagine it was some sort of violent infraction.
I imagine the biting
that might have been enough.
Probably enough. Yeah.
Probably. Yeah, you're right. They also say that she hadn't taken responsibility or shown any remorse, concluding that she would be a danger to society if she were released.
Yeah.
Now, during this proceeding, 3 people who were close to Diane Whipple spoke emotionally as they told the parole panel why Marjorie should stay incarcerated. So Diane's partner, Sharon Smith, spoke. So did Diane's aunt and the wife of Diane's brother. Actually, Diane's brother, Colin Kelly, was supposed to speak, but he just got too upset as the hearing went underway, and his wife ended up saying his statement on his behalf. Mm-hmm. The parole commissioners asked Marjorie if she would own a dog if she were released, and she said no, she would not. But she was then asked about the devastation caused by Diane's death, and she said, quote, "I've always felt responsible for Diane's death in terms of not being able to prevent it or help do more to prevent Bain from doing what he did and stripping her completely naked in that hallway. But Diane seems to have gotten lost, and her loss seems to have gotten lost in the publicity that ensued regarding this incident." So I don't like this. Again, she's deflecting blame.
She doesn't feel responsible, and the parole board's not going to appreciate that because she is responsible.
And I think given her infractions, they probably would have denied her anyway, but she certainly did herself no favors with this statement at all.
No.
Now, Marjorie Knoller will again be eligible for parole in probably another 2 to 3 years, and at which point she will be around 70 years of age.
So what happened to her husband, Robert?
So I believe that during Marjorie's incarceration, the two, I believe they stay married. They kept in touch. But Robert's life was forever changed as a result of this. So he was a baker for a short time. Both of them have obviously had lost their law licenses after these convictions.
Yeah.
But him being a baker didn't really work out for him, and he suffered bouts of homelessness, and he had some serious health issues. He ended up dying of heart failure in a La Jolla nursing home on June 22nd, 2018, ironically, on the very day of his 77th birthday.
It's a sad ending for him as well.
Yeah, so let's see what goes on with Sharon Smith. Now, Sharon Smith, again, Diane's long-term partner, she sued and won a civil suit against Marjorie and Robert for $1.5 million in damages. Meghan, this was groundbreaking and historic, and quite unprecedented for its time, as gay marriage was still illegal in California at the time of the suit. So at first, Sharon wasn't even eligible to sue for damages since her partnership was not acknowledged by the state.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This was a wrongful death suit?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay.
The defense had argued that Sharon had no standing to even file such a lawsuit, and many legal experts actually agreed with this horrific stance.
Well, because even if it is horrific, it was the law.
Yeah. As of this point, no same-sex partner had ever successfully sued for damages in the wrongful death of a partner. But Sharon Smith would change the law because the judge agreed with her and disagreed with the defense.
Wonderful.
And this
And this is how we see progress made.
Exactly. And the civil case was notable in that San Francisco Superior Court ruled in July of 2001 that Sharon Smith was entitled to bring suit as Diane's domestic partner under the Equal Protection Clause.
Ah, okay.
Woohoo! Some good came out of this, right?
I'm glad to see her status was recognized.
Because of her, other status,
Yeah.
moving forward, that was
Yes.
the importance here, is she
Yes.
set a precedent that, domestic partnership was finally being acknowledged under the Equal Protection Clause.
Do you know what year that was?
2001, which I'm shocked
Okay.
at how long it took.
Yeah.
Sharon donated some of the money of the settlement to St. Mary's College of California, where Diane had worked, and this money was used to fund the women's lacrosse team.
Oh, that's nice.
Now, let's move on to the discussion. There are so many different things going on in this case. I feel like there's something to be said here in about how Marjorie and Robert took such a weird parental stance with Paul. So they were his counsel, then his parents. I mean, doesn't this seem like a conflict of interest? Should lawyers be allowed to adopt their once clients?
Everything is weird about this.
Yes.
I don't even know what the legality should be. It strikes me as all wrong.
Yes.
On many different levels. And I do think there's a conflict of interest, but I have no idea what the legal conflict would technically be. If they weren't representing him anymore, I guess.
Also, you could see a situation where you have a lawyer who maybe someone who's claiming they're wrongfully convicted or mistreated, and the lawyer forges, almost a parental relationship with them, and they adopt them because they actually become close with them in a parental figure type of way. That I could see as being, this doesn't seem like that. I mean,
no, it doesn't seem legitimate.
No.
Based on what you said, they wanted to have a three-way marriage with him. And because of that, I mean, it does not seem at all appropriate.
No, and there's so many questions. It's clear what was going on in a way, but it's also unclear if this was a favor to Paul.
Yeah.
He was never getting out. Is it possible that these two wanted to provide a loving home for these dogs? Probably not. It's likely they were holding on to the dogs for Paul with explicit instructions on maybe how to treat the dogs and what to do with them. I think it's clear that they were all in this business together. You would agree with that?
It seems so.
I want to turn to Marjorie's sentence, because this one was a tough one for me.
Okay.
I think you might be surprised, but I think the sentence might be too harsh. I struggle a bit with cases like this because it's hard to prove that the death was foreseeable. It was clearly negligent. But should Marjorie be sentenced to life? Again, the upper end of her sentence is a life sentence.
Well, but Amy, the lower end is 15 years. And had she accepted responsibility and not committed a violent infraction and other behavioral infractions, 15 years would be her presumed parole date.
Yeah, I guess I'm okay with that.
I'm okay with 15 years. I'm fine with 15 years. I do think that this was foreseeable. Actually, her husband lost a finger.
Yeah.
So I think based on that alone, it's foreseeable that these dogs could have absolutely harmed someone and killed someone like they did. I do think this was a foreseen consequence.
Yeah. Yeah.
Life is very long. You're right. Life would be very long, but I'm fine with 15 years. I think that's appropriate.
No, you bring up a good point because 15 years is appropriate. But as you said, if she had spent those 15 years accepting responsibility, expressing remorse, rehabilitating herself, but it sounds like she's doing quite the opposite. But this one's not a very clear-cut one for me.
I understand.
I also don't know the details surrounding exactly what she's doing during her prison time. Yeah, so I think Robert's sentence was probably legitimate.
But he wasn't charged with second-degree murder. His charges were very different.
Yeah, but his charges were also, his charges are pretty severe. I think he maybe a 1-year sentence for his charges was pretty light.
No, that's too lax. I agree. But I just meant the severity of the charges between murder and
for
his
sure.
it was quite different.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think 1 year was too light as well.
And I think 2 years would have been way too light for Marjorie had she had the second-degree murder charges dropped.
Agreed.
I just wonder if the charges were dropped, would Marjorie have continued her relationship with Paul? Would she go on to live a law-abiding life? Probably not.
I think that it would have reinforced that she was right. And just as we learn with learning theory and differential reinforcement, she would have continued the exact life that she wanted to without a regard for what would probably have been, more appropriate and legal and moral. And I think it would have just reinforced her bad behavior, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree with that. So we'll be keeping an eye on this case. I'm curious if she'll be denied parole and what she's going to be doing in the next few years between now and her next parole date. So we will keep an eye on that. I want to point out that these types of cases are very rare.
Yeah.
Of course, there are some other dog deaths or mauling cases, but many of these cases end up in civil court and not criminal court. It's ultimately up to the prosecutor if they have enough evidence to press charges. And every state has very unique laws surrounding these types of cases. I came across a website called dogbitelaw.com.
Okay.
It sounds like a silly name, but there is a ton of information about these types of cases, and they go state by state talking about the legality of, dog attacks in each state and where a case can stand in the civil court versus the criminal court. I did ask a friend of mine who was in law enforcement in New Jersey, and he also was quite surprised by the life sentence. But he said in New Jersey, the outcome of a similar case, it's so circumstantial and such a case-by-case basis. There's no hard and fast rule by which someone would be charged in a death by dog scenario.
That makes sense to me that these cases would be discretionary and case by case. They're not all the same.
Yeah, and they're based on so many factors. Yeah, we don't hear that many criminal cases in this area, luckily, but they're so tragic. And what happened to this woman was preventable. And I think that's what makes this case so infuriating.
I think there are so many things that make this case infuriating. The ethics of lawyers adopting dogs from prisoners that are probably protecting illegal operations, the attitude of these two people, the defendants, to actually blame this blameless victim. This is the perfect storm of factors, and I completely see why the prosecution chose the route they did. And in this case, I think it was appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Meghan, I agree. But luckily in this case, we don't see this in all cases, but for such a tragic case, at least some good came out of it in that Sharon Smith paved the way for other people who are in same-sex relationships to file these wrongful death lawsuits. So I think that's incredible what she did. And I hope that Diane's family has been able to move forward in some way, however that might be possible after such a horrific event.
Yeah, me as well. And you're right. Diane, it seemed that she did not die in vain, which is one positive at least we can take away from this case.
Yeah. Again, if you're interested in learning more about these types of cases, dogbitelaw.com has a ton of information. I thank you all so much for listening today, and we will catch you next time on Women in Crime.
Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonzo. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime.
Sources for today include sfgate.com, courts.ca.gov, dogbitelaw.com, ABC News, the Chicago Tribune, San Jose Mercury News, San Francisco Chronicle, ABC 7 News, Rolling Stone, the American Kennel Association, and saclaw.org.